Hello everyone, and welcome back to Trail of Secrets. I know many of you use these videos to relax and unwind, so before you settle in, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Let me know where you're watching from. I love hearing from all of you. Now let's dive into story number 1. It was a cold November night when I found myself on an unfamiliar road deep in the countryside. I had taken a wrong turn somewhere, and my GPS had given up, leaving me to rely on instinct. The road was narrow, flanked by looming trees whose bare branches tangled overhead, forming a skeletal tunnel. A heavy fog clung to the ground, swirling in my headlights like restless spirits. I had been driving for nearly an hour without seeing another car. The gas gauge blinked its warning at me, but there were no signs of civilization. No gas stations, no houses, nothing but the thick, unbroken stretch of forest. The only sound was the rhythmic hum of my tires on the cracked asphalt. Then out of nowhere, my radio crackled to life. At first, it was just static, a faint hiss that barely registered in my tired mind. But then, beneath the static, I heard something, a voice. It was faint, almost like a whisper carried on the wind. Turn back now. I frowned and adjusted the dial, thinking it was a signal interference, but the voice only grew more distorted. Not safe. They are watching. A chill crept down my spine. I glanced at the dashboard. My radio was off. The volume knob hadn't moved. My fingers felt numb as I reached out and twisted the knob anyway. The static stopped instantly and silence filled the car once more. I told myself it was a malfunction. A glitch. A stray signal from some distant station. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. My hands tightened around the wheel as I pressed the accelerator, eager to get out of those woods as soon as possible. Then, my headlights caught something ahead. A figure stood in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, my heart hammering. The car skidded slightly before coming to a stop just a few feet away from them. It was a man, tall, wearing a long coat that billowed slightly in the night breeze. His face was hidden beneath the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat. I swallowed hard, my fingers hovering over the lock button. Every instinct screamed at me to drive away, but something about him felt off. He didn't move, didn't react to the sudden halt of my car. He just stood there, as still as the trees around him. I hesitated for only a moment before flicking on my high beams, hoping to get a better look. And that's when I saw it. His face, or rather, the absence of one. There was only smooth, featureless skin where his eyes, nose, and mouth should have been. A scream caught in my throat as the figure took a single step forward. I didn't wait for more. My foot slammed onto the gas and my car lurched forward, swerving around the figure. My tires screeched against the pavement as I sped away, my pulse pounding in my ears, but the nightmare wasn't over. A glance in the rearview mirror sent ice through my veins. He was still there, standing in the middle of the road. Only now, there were more of them. A dozen figures, identical in their faceless terror, lined the road behind me. I pressed the gas harder, my car racing down the darkened path. The trees blurred past in my peripheral vision. I didn't dare look back again. My only focus was on getting out of those woods, on finding a town, a gas station, any sign of life. And then, suddenly, my headlights illuminated a road sign. Welcome to Ash Hollow. I had never heard of Ash Hollow. It wasn't on any map. I had seen, but at that moment I didn't care. I needed to get away from whatever those things were. The town was eerily quiet as I pulled onto the main street. Small shops lined the road, their windows dark and empty. A gas station sat on the corner, its neon sign flickering weakly. Relief flooded me as I pulled in, parking beside the single rusted pump. I stepped out, my legs shaky beneath me. The air was thick with silence, as if the whole town was holding its breath. I approached the station's entrance, peering through the glass door. The store was empty. No cashier, no customers. Nothing but rows of dusty shelves and an old cash register. The hairs on my arms stood on end. Something wasn't right. Then, from the back of the store, I heard it, a whisper. They followed you. You shouldn't have stopped. I spun around just as the streetlights flickered and went out, plunging the town into darkness. My breath came in ragged gasps as I stumbled back toward my car. But before I could reach it, movement in the shadows caught my eye. They were here. The faceless figures stood at the edge of the gas station's lot, unmoving, watching. Their presence sucked the warmth from the air, leaving behind an oppressive, suffocating cold. And then they started moving. Not walking, gliding, as if their feet never touched the ground. Their movements were unnatural, jerky, like marionettes, controlled by unseen strings. I lunged for my car, yanking the door open and diving inside. My hands fumbled for the keys. My fingers were numb, trembling as I turned the ignition. The engine roared to life, and without hesitation I slammed it into reverse, tires screeching as I backed onto the road. The figures did not chase me. They simply stood, their faceless heads tilting as they watched me flee. I didn't stop driving until I saw the first familiar landmark, a highway sign pointing me toward home. It was as if I had crossed some invisible threshold, breaking free from whatever nightmare had ensnared me. To this day, I have never been able to find Ash Hollow on a map. I've searched, driven through the area again, but the town is gone, as if it never existed. But I know what I saw, and sometimes late at night when I'm driving alone, I glance in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see those faceless figures standing in the distance waiting. Story number 2. It was a chilly November night, the air thick with fog as I drove along the desolate stretch of highway that cut through the countryside. I had spent the weekend at my parents' house, a rare visit, and was now making the long drive back to the city. The road was empty, my only companions being the rhythmic flicker of my headlights against the mist and the distant hum of my tires on the asphalt. An hour into the drive, I noticed something odd. The inside of my car had grown colder, as if someone had left a window open. I checked, but they were all shut tight. Shrugging it off, I reached for the heater dial when a whisper brushed against my ear. "Slow down." I slammed on the brakes, my pulse skyrocketing as I frantically looked around. The road ahead was clear, the passenger seat was empty, and yet I had heard it. Soft, insistent, right beside me. My breathing was ragged as I tried to rationalize what had just happened. Maybe I was tired. Maybe the wind had made a sound that my mind twisted into words. I shook my head and pressed forward, my grip tightening on the steering wheel. Minutes passed, and just as my nerves started to settle, it happened again. "Take the next exit." This time, the voice was clearer, more urgent. I swallowed hard, my eyes darting to the GPS. There was an exit half a mile ahead, leading to a small town I had never heard of. My instincts screamed at me to ignore the voice, to keep driving and forget this ever happened. But a strange pull made me obey. I flicked on my turn signal and took the exit, my hands clammy against the wheel. The road led me into a quiet town, the streetlights casting eerie glows on the deserted sidewalks. The place seemed abandoned, the buildings old and worn, like a town forgotten by time. My headlights skimmed over a sign at the entrance, "Welcome to Ashwood." Population 0. A chill slithered down my spine. Was this some kind of joke? How could a town have no population? I drove slowly, my unease growing with each passing second. Then, as I turned onto the main street, I saw them. Figures, standing in the fog. Dozens of them, their silhouettes barely visible through the haze. They were completely still, facing my car, watching. Panic surged through me, and I threw the car into reverse, my tires screeching against the cracked pavement. But as I did, the voice returned, now a whispering chorus, echoing all around me. "Don't run." My hands trembled as I gripped the wheel. The figures hadn't moved, but I could feel them, feel their eyes locked onto me, feel the weight of their presence pressing down on my chest. I had to get out of there. Ignoring the voice, I slammed the gas pedal, my heart hammering as I sped past the silent watchers. The moment I cleared the town's border, The cold inside my car lifted and the whispering stopped. I didn't dare look back. I drove straight home, my mind racing, my thoughts tangled in fear and disbelief. Had I imagined it? Had exhaustion played tricks on me? The next morning I searched for Ashwood. There was no record of it, no maps, no history, nothing. It was as if the town didn't exist. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. And sometimes, on long drives alone, when the road is empty and the night is still, I swear I can hear that whisper again. Story number 3. It all started on a cold winter night, the kind where the air is so sharp it cuts through your skin like tiny shards of glass. I had been driving for hours, eager to reach my grandmother's house before the storm rolled in. The sky was a thick blanket of gray, and the road ahead was flanked by endless stretches of snow-covered trees. Somewhere along the way, I noticed the first sign of trouble. My fuel gauge was lower than I had thought, and I was still miles away from the nearest gas station. The realization sent a shiver down my spine, but I pressed on, hoping I could make it without running out. Then, as if on cue, view of the surrounding forest. Inside it was just as cozy as the photos had promised. Wooden walls, a stone fireplace, and a faint smell of pine that made it feel like a home away from home. We spent the first night relaxing by the fire, sipping wine and talking until the flames died down to embers. By the time we went to bed, the forest outside was pitch black, the kind of darkness you only find in places far removed from civilization. The only sounds were the faint rustling of leaves in the breeze and the occasional chirp of crickets. But sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to a strange sound. It was faint at first, barely audible over the quiet hum of the wind. A low, rhythmic tapping, like someone knocking softly on wood. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding as I strained to listen. The sound was coming from outside, near the porch. Told myself it was probably just a branch swaying in the wind, brushing against the side of the cabin, but as I listened, the tapping grew louder and more deliberate. It wasn't random, it was rhythmic, almost like a pattern. Tap, tap, tap. Pause. Tap, tap, tap. Mia, I whispered, shaking her awake. She groaned, pulling the blanket over her head. Mia, wake up, do you hear that? She mumbled something incoherent, but as the tapping continued, she sat up, her eyes wide with confusion. What is that? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know. We sat there in silence, listening as the tapping continued. It was coming from the front porch right outside the door. Mia grabbed her phone and turned on the flashlight, but when she shone it through the window, we couldn't see anything. The porch was empty. Maybe it's an animal, I suggested, though I didn't believe it. The sound was too deliberate, too precise to be random. Should we check it out? Mia asked, her voice trembling. I shook my head. Let's just wait. If it's an animal, it'll go away. But the tapping didn't stop. It went on for what felt like hours, the same rhythmic pattern repeating over and over. Finally, as the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, it stopped. Just stopped, as suddenly as it had begun. We spent the rest of the morning trying to shake off the unease. The logical part of me wanted to believe it had been an animal, maybe a bird pecking at the wooden railing. But deep down I knew better. Mia suggested we pack up and leave, but I convinced her to stay. After all, we'd driven hours to get here, and I didn't want to let a weird noise ruin the trip. The rest of the day passed without incident. We hiked through the woods, cooked dinner on the grill, and tried to laugh off the events of the previous night. By the time the sun set, we were feeling more relaxed, ready to enjoy the rest of our getaway. But that night, the tapping returned. It started around midnight, just as we were getting ready for bed. This time it was louder, more insistent. Tap, tap, tap. Pause, tap, tap, tap. We froze, our eyes meeting in silent alarm. Mia grabbed her phone again, shining the flashlight through the window. But just like the night before, there was nothing there. The porch was empty. I felt a chill run down my spine. Maybe we should leave, Mia said, her voice shaking. I nodded. Let's pack up and go. We hurried to gather our things, throwing clothes into our bags without bothering to fold them. But as we were zipping up our suitcases, the tapping changed. It was no longer rhythmic. It was frantic, erratic, as if whatever was out there was growing impatient. And then, for the first time, we heard something else. A voice. It was faint, barely audible over the tapping, but it was there. A low, guttural whisper, so quiet I couldn't make out the words. My blood ran cold as I realized it wasn't coming from the porch. It was coming from the window. Mia and I froze, our eyes locked on the window as the whispering grew louder. Slowly she raised her phone, the flashlight beam trembling as she aimed it at the glass. The light caught something, a face, pale, gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. It was pressed against the glass, its mouth moving as it whispered words we couldn't understand. We screamed, stumbling backward as the face disappeared. The tapping stopped, replaced by the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling the cabin. "Let's go," I shouted, grabbing Mia's arm. We bolted for the door, throwing it open and running to the car. The forest was eerily silent. The only sound our ragged breathing as we fumbled with the keys. The engine roared to life and we sped down the dirt road, not daring to look back. We didn't stop until we reached a gas station miles away. The bright lights and hum of activity a stark contrast to the darkness we'd left behind. We sat in the car for what felt like hours, trying to make sense of what had happened. But no matter how many times we replayed it in our minds, we couldn't explain it. The next day, we called the rental company to cancel our stay. The woman on the phone seemed surprised when we mentioned the cabin, her voice tight as she said, "That place hasn't been rented out in years." My stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" "We booked it online." There was a long pause before she replied. "We took that listing down after what happened. I'm not sure how you even found it." "What happened?" Mia asked, her voice barely audible. There was another pause, then a sigh. "The last guests reported hearing noises, seeing things. They left in the middle of the night, just like you. We sent someone to check it out, but they didn't find anything. The owners decided to stop renting it out after that." We hung up without saying much else. To this day, I don't know what we experienced in that cabin. But sometimes, late at night, I hear it again in my dreams. The tapping, the whispers, and the face pressed against the glass. Story number 8. A few years ago, I took a job in a town I'd never heard of. It was one of those places that didn't show up on most maps, tucked away in a forgotten corner of the country. The kind of town where you feel like time itself has slowed down, where the streets are lined with old Victorian houses and the air carries the faint smell of wood smoke no matter the season. The job was temporary, 3 months working as a substitute teacher at the local high school. My plan was simple: make some money, enjoy the quiet, and then move on. I'd been bouncing from one place to another for years, never staying long enough to put down roots. This was just another stop along the way. When I arrived, the town seemed almost too perfect. The streets were clean, the people friendly, and the high school was small but charming, with ivy climbing the brick walls. It felt like a scene out of an old movie. But there was something off, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. It started with the students. They were polite, almost unnervingly so. Every good morning and thank you felt rehearsed, like they were reciting lines from a script. They weren't rowdy or distracted like most teenagers I'd taught before. They paid attention in class, turned in their homework on time, and never caused trouble. At first, I thought I'd hit the jackpot. What teacher wouldn't want a classroom full of perfect students? But the longer I stayed, the more their perfection began to feel unnatural. One afternoon, about 2 weeks in, I decided to stay late to grade some papers. The school was empty by then, the hallways silent except for the faint hum of the fluorescent lights. I was sitting at my desk when I heard it, a faint sound like whispering coming from the hallway. At first, I thought it was just the wind, or maybe one of the janitors talking to themselves. But the whispers grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't just one voice. It was several, overlapping like a dozen people murmuring at once. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was urgent, almost pleading. Curiosity got the better of me. I stepped out into the hallway, the sound growing louder as I followed it. The whispers seemed to be coming from the far end of the building, near the old library. The library was rarely used. Most of the books were decades out of date, and the students preferred the computers in the newer wing of the school. As I approached the library, the whispers stopped. The silence was sudden and absolute, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. I hesitated for a moment before pushing open the heavy wooden door. The library was dark, the only light coming from a single bulb flickering near the center of the room. The air was heavy, carrying the faint scent of dust and mildew. I stepped inside, my footsteps echoing on the wooden floor. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. No response. I moved deeper into the room, passing rows of towering bookshelves. The flickering light cast long, shifting shadows that seemed to move on their own. I was about to turn back when something caught my eye, a book lying open on one of the tables. Curious, I approached the table. The book was old, its leather cover cracked and faded. The pages were yellowed, the text written in a language I didn't recognize. Strange symbols and patterns that seemed to twist and writhe on the page. As I stared at it, a sudden wave of nausea washed over me, and the room seemed to tilt. Took a step back, my heart pounding. That's when I noticed the chairs around the table, 5 of them, all pulled out as if someone had been sitting there. But the seats were empty. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The whispers started again, louder this time, coming from all around me. I spun around, my eyes darting from shadow to shadow. For a brief moment, I thought I saw movement. A figure, slipping between the shelves, too fast to make out clearly. That was enough for me. I bolted out of the library, slamming the door behind me. The whispers stopped as soon as I stepped into the hallway, replaced by the familiar hum of the fluorescent lights. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was watching me. The next day, I tried to forget about it. I told myself it had been my imagination, a trick of the light and the stress of a long day. But as the weeks went on, the strange occurrences became harder to ignore. Sometimes I'd catch a student staring at me, their expression blank and unblinking. Other times I'd hear faint whispers during class, though none of the students seemed to notice. And then there were the dreams, vivid, unsettling dreams of the library, the strange book, and the shadows that seemed to move on their own. One night, I woke up to a sound outside my apartment. It was the same whispering, faint but unmistakable. I looked out the window, but the street was empty. Still, the whispers continued, growing louder until they seemed to be coming from inside the apartment. I checked every room, every closet, but found nothing. The whispers stopped just as suddenly as they had started, leaving me alone in the silence. By the time my 3 months were up, I was more than ready to leave. I packed my things and drove out of town without looking back. But even now, years later, I can't shake the feeling that I left something behind, or that something followed me. I've tried to make sense of what happened, to convince myself it was all in my head. But every now and then, I'll hear it, again. The whispers, faint, fleeting, but unmistakable. And when I do, I remember the book, the strange symbols and the shadows that seem to move on their own. I don't know what I encountered in that town, and I'm not sure I want to. But one thing is certain, some places are better left forgotten.